In this lesson, we will cover the overall process for the most common question format you're going to find in the verbal reasoning section, and that's going to be reading comprehension. So, just logistically, you're going to need to assume that there are four passages in the verbal reasoning, and each of them are going to have 3 to 4 questions each. You're going to want to allocate a minimum of 5 minutes per passage to properly address the questions. And if you were to work this out, that would be about 20 minutes for the reading comprehension and about 25 minutes allocated for the remaining critical reasoning questions. So if we assume somewhere around 13 questions for the reading comprehension, that'll leave about 10 and about 2.5 minutes per critical reasoning. And this is important because with the reading comprehension, you should pick up speed as you're working through the questions. Now, this can also be content for data insights, multi-source reasoning, and potentially two-part analysis questions in that section. So you could have some longer form passages over there. And strategically, you're going to want to assume about that 2 minutes per question in the verbal section, but about 3 minutes per question for the data insights, multi-source reasoning, or longer form two-part analysis, single question side questions in the data insights that will use some of these reading comprehension style tactics. You're going to want to spend a maximum, though, of about 4 minutes to complete a full read of the passage, or in the multi-source reasoning, the different tabs and the first question. You really can't spend more time than that, although you can spend more time on this particular individual question than anywhere else on the exam, because you may decide, I just need to read it up front to understand everything. And you can take notes as you go to help allow your reading for one question assist with your answer for another question pertaining to that individual passage. And you do have to avoid skipping passages or tabs proactively, even if you're behind pace in the verbal or data insights questions, because if we're looking at a multi-source reasoning question set, that's going to be 3 questions tied to the information. And as we've already stated here, in reading comprehension, you're looking at 4 passages, and each of them is going to have 3 or 4 questions. And it's just too important to try to move too quickly here, because you can quickly miss 2, 3, or 4 questions in a row, and that's going to have too much of an impact on your exam score. So now we're going to talk about process of elimination. So the process of elimination here is really key. And the first marking here is probably pretty self-explanatory. You're going to, on your scratch pad, put a check mark next to something that you say is correct, but you're going to have a clear metric for this. You're going to say that it's correct because it matches your prediction for what the task asked you to do to answer the question, or it specifically matches direct information in the passage that you can reference immediately. Now, an X mark next to an answer choice is going to indicate something is incorrect. So that's you saying that you can definitively say why the choice is objectively wrong without any hesitation. But of course, with the reading comprehension, often folks will find themselves kind of down to 2. So the next 2 markings is going to facilitate that part of it. So the little tilde or squiggle here is a maybe. It's something that you read and you're kind of like, this is a square peg going into the round hole. It's like 2/3 of the way down, but I can't say that it's 100% correct or incorrect with any true certainty. So you just kind of put that little squiggle next to something like, maybe. But then you also want to have in your quiver a question mark that means that you truly can't define something. So that's either the vocabulary in the choice or the impact of the answer choice on the information in the passage. So you're like, it's relevant, it's using terms, but I truly believe this has like 9 double negatives and I can't follow which direction it goes in. And that can be how they generate difficulty, is just by making an answer choice harder to parse and understand. So strategically, what does this mean? Well, we've got a clear order of preference in terms of what we would choose. We know we're not going to choose the X. We know we should choose the check. But when we're down to 2, when we're down to being between the question mark and the squiggle, we're actually going to prefer the question mark because it theoretically could be 100% correct, whereas the squiggle cannot. And let's think about this from a logical perspective. So let's have a little thought experiment. If we went, and if you don't speak German, if we went to Munich and we asked a nice Bavarian fellow, Hans, where's the nearest restaurant? And Hans were to reply in German, I don't speak German. If you, the viewer, do not speak German, you and I would both look at Hans's German and his response in German and go, I don't know what that means. But theoretically, Hans from Munich, by telling us where the nearest restaurant is in German, could be 100% correct. We just don't understand it. Whereas a squiggle is something that cannot, because by our metric, it would already be a check mark. Now, you can always allow two-pass elimination by using the question mark or squiggle on the first pass through the choices if you have any doubt as to if a choice matches or doesn't. And you have to be honest with yourself. When something does match, use the check mark. When it doesn't and you can write out a reason, use the X mark. But when you're having trouble with that, recognize that usually at least 2 or 3 are pretty easy to eliminate. Get rid of them and then go into a closer examination of what remains. And then you want to focus on actions and descriptions for definitive reasons to eliminate when you get down to 2. So rather getting into a semantic fight of, is this a theory? Is this a hypothesis? Recognize that those two terms are ultimately synonymous. Instead, look at the difference between discuss and debate, or more and most. Those are definitive quantities and actions, and they're going to have a bigger difference. So don't just look for terms that you're familiar with. Look for actions and descriptions that are definitive reasons to eliminate rather than to select as well. Because if you were going to select something proactively once you're down to 2, it would have been a check already. So force yourself to come up with those reasons to eliminate when you're down to 2. So this is how you'll frequently encounter the reading comprehension on the GMAT Focus exam. On the left-hand side will be a static block of text for the passage, and that static text may have a little scroll bar. Make sure you note if there is a scroll bar so that you're not missing text on the bottom. But then on the right-hand side, you're going to have your question text, and you're going to want to read the question first before you determine what you need to read in the passage. So read that first question to determine if it's a broad or specific subject, meaning does it ask about the passage overall? Does it ask about a specific piece of information about in the passage? And then determine how much you should read to address that task and subject specifically. For earlier and longer passages or broad subject first questions, generally you'll want to consider an upfront read and a passage map of notes, and we'll see what a passage map looks like here in a moment. For later and shorter passages, though, or if you have a specific subject for the first question of the passage, targeted reading, meaning reading just for that term or location, may be more efficient. And you'll always want to read at least one sentence above and below a term or location reference to be able to make a valid prediction from the surrounding context. But recognize that generally the way the exam rewards students is through flexibility. So there should be, for most high scoring GMAT Focus verbal performances, an opportunity where you may need a passage map, and there may be an opportunity where you shouldn't use a passage map. And that time management piece is so important. So try to go into the reading comprehension aspect of the verbal reasoning with the idea that sometimes I might read up front, sometimes I might not. But this comes with a caveat. If you are of an opinion that you always have to read up front, otherwise you will miss the entire meaning of the passage, you may just have to do that and sacrifice critical reasoning questions because, again, it's just too important to do relatively well on these passages, whereas a critical reasoning question is going to be self-contained, so you can kind of throw that away a little bit more readily without as big of a negative impact. So let's see a sample broad subject question. We've got the primary purpose of the passages too. So we see primary purpose. So if this were our first question for this passage, we'd go ahead and move straight to the passage mapping. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to read a paragraph or approximately 10 lines of text and then stop to consider it. Then we're going to take a brief note capturing the main subject and action of that paragraph, or approximately 10 lines. We want to maintain the main subject or action from your bullet notes to create an overall narrative in your map from the passage. But if you find your main subject or action changes unexpectedly, you may have to revisit your prior note to make sure that you were actually focused on whatever the main actor or action was. And you can write out a brief overall summary as a prediction for a primary purpose or main idea question as kind of the last step of your passage. But ultimately, the big thing here is you want to focus on the main ideas, not the details. We're not going to be taking notes as we go about every detail because we know that we need just an overall understanding. And what the passage map, and hence the term, should really do is give you a map of where to go to find more information about different subjects once questions start asking about them. So we would read the first one and the first paragraph, and we've got the public health and economic efficiency approaches to choosing a role for government often reach opposite conclusions. And you can see in our passage map, ultimately, we're going to say PH and EE, meaning public health and economic efficiency. But you're not going to write this out in the original while you're reading, because you got to figure out what the main idea is. So then we got, from the public health perspective, the potential for illness or injury is sufficient to justify government action. Large numbers of deaths or illnesses are more compelling reasons for government action. The dollar value of benefits and costs derived from government programs does not necessarily enter the public health decision calculus. Alternatively, economic efficiency demands that proposed government programs clear two hurdles. First, there must be an efficiency problem for government to solve. Second, a corrective program must be worth the cost. So we revisit in our mind what we just read, and we know that it was all about that PH and EE reaching opposite conclusions that's on the right-hand side. And we know that the public health, government action can be justified just for health reasons, but the economic efficiency requires government programs must solve some sort of efficiency problem and be worth the cost. And we distill that entire paragraph of what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences down to like one compound thought. And that's what you really need to do. So let's read the second paragraph now. So far, economists have not reached a consensus on whether obesity raises economic efficiency problems. If obesity results from informed individuals willingly making diet and lifestyle choices, there is no way to argue for inefficiency. It must be concluded that many are willing to accept extra weight because the cost of diet and exercise is too high. On the other hand, arguments for intervention could be mounted on the basis of imperfect information about the relationship between diet and health. Nevertheless, many in the public health community have proposed interventions, and taxing snack foods has been advocated frequently. But without a clear statement of the efficiency problem caused by being overweight and obesity, we cannot say whether such taxes might increase or decrease economic efficiency, i.e., whether benefits exceed cost. So now we know that we're basically taking what we talked about in the first paragraph about pH and EE and applying it to obesity. And the pH side says that it is potentially necessary, just from a public health perspective, to intervene on behalf of fixing obesity. But the economists and the EE approach says that there isn't necessarily a clear statement of an efficiency problem or a cost-benefit analysis that says we should engage governmentally with obesity or obesity combating programs. So you can see my second paragraph passage map. Economists, no consensus on obesity raising EE problems. And if obesity is from choice, no clear EE need, but PH is proposed fighting obesity for health reasons. Pretty much summarizes everything that we read, everything that I just said. And it efficiently tells me what's in this second paragraph. It's about obesity, whereas the first one was just setting the background. So then you can write out, since we know our first question was about the primary purpose, we can write out a main idea prediction. Something like evaluate PH for public health and EE for economic efficiency, health philosophies, public health philosophies, before considering with an example of programs to fight obesity. Simple enough, doesn't go into the details, but I've got a main idea. Now, bringing back in our primary subject, we know that the question was to figure out what the primary purpose of the passage was, and we've got our main idea prediction that we just produced. So when we introduce the answer choices, we now compare those against our prediction, not against the passage. So choice A, advocate for a change in public health policy. That does not match our prediction at all, and advocating for a change is way too strong for the author of this passage. So you could just write, no advocation, or however you want to articulate it on your scratch pad, but you've got a clear reason to eliminate A. And we've got B, justify governmental action with economic evidence. Well, again, there's no clear path forward for governmental action. So we can eliminate B as being a bit too extreme based on that. And our main idea prediction of just considering, not justifying. Then we've got choice C, examine possible causes for public weight excess. We're not actually doing that like at any point. And maybe you could convince me that A or B would be like kind of a squiggle if you were a little bit unsure. But choice C, there's nothing about the causes for the obesity. It's just evaluating whether government should or should not intervene to kind of combat obesity. Then choice D, argue that health concerns supersede economic consensus. So there's no argument here again. And they're not on either side in terms of the author of whether the economic or the public health should take primacy. Now, you may also say, I don't know what supersede means. If you don't know what supersede means, you have to put a question mark next to this one, But then if we look at choice E, consider variables impacting government decision making. Well, yeah, it's the public health, economic efficiency. We've got these different philosophies, and there's definitely a decision making process occurring here. We just haven't decided which to go with. And choice E, considering variables, nice, bland answer choice. We'll talk about bland here in a moment again. The correct answer for reading comprehension questions is generally going to be in some way unattractive. So you have to challenge yourself to find the relatively benign and reserved kind of phrasing that they use that does capture what's happening in the passage, because they're intentionally trying to make it seem a little bit more hidden. But here we'd have choice E as our correct answer if we match it to our prediction, even if we didn't necessarily know what supersede meant in choice D. So now we'll keep the same passage, and now we have a specific subject tax, because we've got the author most likely mentions taxing snack foods in order to. So you can see that the phrase taxing snack foods is highlighted. And this may happen on the exam. It might not happen on the exam. Sometimes they highlight, sometimes they don't. So when you've got a clear term, you're going to have to go at least a sentence above. So we've got the taxing snack foods here. We go up a sentence above. We go on the other hand. We're coming into the middle of an idea. So we go back one more sentence and we see if obesity results. I'm like, okay, this is kind of a new thought. And we're just going to read through that highlighted phrase of taxing snack foods and try to figure out why the author mentions taxing snack foods once we read and reread from if obesity results, because you're not going to be able to remember based on this one specific detail. So if obesity results from informed individuals willingly making diet and lifestyle choices, there's no way to argue for inefficiency. It must be concluded that many are willing to accept extra weight because the cost of diet and exercise is too high. On the other hand, arguments for intervention could be mounted on the basis of imperfect information about the relationship between diet and health. Nevertheless, many in the public health community have proposed interventions, and taxing snack foods has been advocated frequently, but without a clear statement of the efficiency problem caused by being overweight and obesity, we cannot say whether such taxes might increase or decrease economic efficiency, i.e., whether benefits exceed costs. So we know, and we can use as our own prediction, that taxing snack foods is basically something that has been advocated as an obesity intervention, that we don't know whether it's going to work or not. So now we look at the answer choices and cross-check against that prediction. So choice A, recommend a course of action for raising government revenues. Well, again, the author is not as strong as to actually recommend anything. The author is kind of equivocating throughout this passage, isn't certain about what's going to happen, just giving the considerations, and we're not concerned with revenues at all, so A could be eliminated. Cite a policy that is likely to reduce public obesity. Well, again, the author does not indicate whether taxing snack foods will or will not work, so that likely to reduce is extreme. We can eliminate choice B. Choice C, propose an alternative health intervention. Well, an alternative to what? And the author, again, isn't taking a side, so we can eliminate choice C. Identify a method of diet improvement that has support. Now, this kind of goes against the overall author's perspective, but we know that taxing snack foods has been advocated frequently by many in the public health community, and this does match choice D perfectly. But this is a common way that the exam can try to get you to grab something that's incorrect, is they'll give you a specific detail question that kind of goes against the overall main tone of the passage, because we know the author isn't recommending taxing snack foods, but we do know definitively from the surrounding context that taxing snack foods is a method of diet improvement that has some support. And then choice E, defend the economist's lack of consensus. The author is not defending anybody. The author is really just kind of stating the facts and staying relatively ambivalent. But here you can see how to work through a specific subject question task once you've done your passage map up front and know exactly where to go look and understand how much you need to read for the surrounding context. So let's just recap our reading comprehension process. Step one, you got to read the question, determine the subject and task, and set up your scratch map. Then step two, you're going to read what you need. And if that's a broad subject or first question of the passage, it very well could involve a full upfront read with a passage map of notes. If it's a specific question, a specific subject question, or it's not the first question of the passage, you will probably want to consider targeted reading. You're really not going to ever want to do a passage map after the first question. You either have to do it at that time or just let it slide after you've decided to go by targeted reading throughout, even if the final question of the passage is asking for the main idea, and that can happen from time to time. So anything after the first question, targeted reading. First question, you want to make a conscious decision about whether you need to engage or should engage with that upfront passage map. Then step 3 is going to be to predict what the answer should do to proactively address that question task, so you're not just letting the answer choices dictate everything. And then step 4 is going to be to process eliminate for clear and objective reasons. And when you're down to 2, your default is going to be to select the option with fewer direct terms from the passage and a less absolute claim. In short, we will choose to go bland when we're down to 2. Pick the one that says less and uses more just strange terms that aren't directly from the passage, because they love to use memory traps which just incorrectly apply proper nouns, specific terms from the passage that you remember in hopes that you'll grab it, not really considering what it is meaning. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and see how we would execute a couple of practice questions with our reading comprehension process on the GMAT Focus Edition. So here we've got a little passage and a first question. We're going to set up the scratch work as always. We've got A through E. We write a little line over top. And when we see the author is primarily concerned with, we can just shorthand this as why was it written. Now, because we've got a full subject or a full passage subject question here, we're being asked about the passage overall, I'm probably going to go ahead and engage with an upfront read. So that means I'm going to just set up here, and I know I'm actually not necessarily cheating as much as it may seem by using a text box here just for ease of use so everybody can read the handwriting. Remember that with the online GMAT Focus, you actually have the engagement of a little text box that you can use. Most people don't use it, but it's something that you should be aware of existing. So I'm just going to write a little P1 and P2 for my passage 1 and passage 2 parts of the map. So let's read the paragraph 1 first. So possibly the most critical factor in the Hubble Space Telescope's tremendous success has to do with the manner in which it is operated. Hubble is a public facility observatory open for use by any astronomer from around the world. Each year, an announcement goes out to the worldwide community soliciting research proposals for use of Hubble and its instrumentation. That instrumentation is a complementary set of cameras, spectrographs, and other more specialized devices, such as stellar coronagraphs and interferometers. It is extremely versatile and covers a wide range of performance characteristics, such as sensitivity, resolution, and wavelength coverage. Taken together, the Hubble instruments provide essentially a complete toolbox for astronomers to utilize in attacking almost any problem in modern optical astronomy. Wow, there's a lot of technical terms that my non-scientific mind really gets kind of lost in, but I don't need them. All I need to know for paragraph 1 is we're basically describing why the HST for Hubble Space Telescope is great. And I'm just going to summarize it like that. We've got all the different instruments. We've got all these things, and they can tack any problem in modern optical astronomy. I'm keeping it that simple because that's really what's happening there. Then we read the second paragraph. Hubble observations have yielded major advances in virtually every area of astronomy and astrophysics. The mechanism by which this is achieved is the open proposal, solicitation, peer review, and selection process that brings into the Hubble Research Program observers from the entire international astronomical community. The demand for Hubble observing time is huge. In a typical proposal cycle, approximately 5 or 6 times as much observing time is requested as is available. Many extremely worthy research proposals are rejected each cycle simply because there is not nearly enough time on the telescope to go around. Only the very best scientific ideas put forth by the community find their way onto Hubble's observing schedule. So paragraph 2 explains why everyone cannot necessarily get to use the HST because there's just not enough time. There's more people that want to access this thing than there is time to use it. So we've got a relatively basic little structure here, and I'm going to go straight to my answer choices now rather than writing out a second um, summary because it's probably not necessary. I've got what I need. So publicizing an exploratory resource. Well, we're probably thinking about this term publicizing. And for choice A, you can either X this if you're like, it's definitely not publicity. I can't say that that's it. Or I might just use the squiggle here. Now, marketing the Hubble Space Telescope makes it sound like we're trying to sell the thing. And that's definitely not what is happening. So I'd get rid of that. Now, explaining the utility and uses of a tool. Well, we explained why it's great. And we talked about how not everyone can get to it, but I guess that's kind of using it. So we'll use that as a squiggle as well. Identifying valid space research. We don't say what makes the space research valid versus less valid. And we're not actually rejecting galactic research proposals. And when you come back up and you consider between the two squiggles, you're probably going to say, yeah, C is a better option because publicizing and marketing, if marketing's wrong, publicizing probably is as well. And you can see the utility in, we have our passage map. We will use that. And I'm actually going to even copy and paste it as we scroll down to our next question for this passage, because it will help us work through where to find information for our next question here, which is more dealing with a specific detail. So we've got another scratchpad setup, A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top. And we're being asked for, according to the passage, which of the following is a consideration in selecting a project to use the Hubble Space Telescope? So what is C for HST project use? So I just rephrased that for myself and I'm like, okay, I know what C means. It's a consideration. And I know all of this is in our answers, is in our second paragraph because we're talking about why everyone can't necessarily use it. So that's going to be our second paragraph. So we have all of this information here. And because I know where to go, I can do a little bit more cross-checking from the answer choices. So proof that similar experimentation has already yielded major astronomical advances. Well, we haven't actually talked about proof of anything, and we know that some gets rejected, so A is out. Validation of a project's worthiness by disinterested contemporary scientists. That's a lot of language. Maybe we don't know what disinterested means. We'll use a question mark here. Now, governmental sponsorship is not in there at all, so we can eliminate choice C for that. Affirmation of plans to use a limited amount of the telescope's resources. Well, this is a big old trap because it's not about using only part of the resources. It's that the telescope itself is a limited resource, or at least time with it. So D is out and is a wonderful memory trap because we're like, yeah, that's definitely limited resource, but that's not what we're being asked for here. And project rejection in a prior Hubble telescope proposal cycle, well, that's not it either because it doesn't say that. It actually says that, it could be rejected multiple times, theoretically, even. So that's not going to be it. And you can see the benefit of the question mark. Now, of course, if you know what disinterested means, it just means that you've got people who are unbiased. And that's the entirety of this peer review selection process where they get to basically you have the scientists themselves deciding which project should go forward. So now that you've seen the overall reading comprehension approach, go ahead and do some practice drills on your own to improve at this very important aspect of the reading of the verbal section and potentially some of the multi-source reasoning and two-part analysis questions in the data insights section as well.